ecumenical movement in the Christian church has made some unexpected and unprecedented strides forward. Central to this movement is renewed reflection on the nature of the Christian church and increased effort to implement unity. The results of the Second Vatican Council is the most obvious public example of the progress in this regard. And on our own campus, the activities of the Augsburg Ecumenical Forum is evidence of interest in this area. One of the necessary implications of ecumenical thinking within the Christian church is to consider carefully again the relation between Christians and Jews. The problem of the relation between Christians and Jews was the burning problem for the early church. The writings of the New Testament bear witness that there is no easy answer to this problem. During the past 5 years, along with developments in the ecumenical movement, there has also developed closer relations between Jews and Christians and an increase in creative thinking in this area. Between 1963 and 1965, the Second Vatican Council discussed this matter and published its declaration on the relationship of the Church to non-Christian religions. Concurrently with this, the provocative play by Rolf Hochhuth, the deputy, appeared. And of greatest importance for us is the Logum Cluster Conference with the theme, The Church and the Jewish People, a conference sponsored by the Lutheran World Federation and held in Denmark in the year 1964. Last year, on the local level, over 60 Christians and Jews met at St. Olaf College for an interfaith dialogue. Now, I think that this is the first time that our speaker for this morning has visited the Augsburg campus. His visit and his address this morning come within the new and vitally important context of interfaith dialogue. The Dr. Rabbi Max Shapiro is the spiritual leader of the Temple Israel in Minneapolis. He teaches as resident lecturer in Judaism at Hamline University and is a member of the faculty of the Continuation Center of the University of Minnesota. He lectures frequently throughout the state. He has written numerous articles for professional journals, and he has served as a member of important state and local commissions. It is under the auspices of the Jewish Chautauqua Society that Dr. Shapiro addresses us today on the theme, Questions Christians Are Asking. Dr. Shapiro.
Thank you, Dr. Skibby. Usually when I talk to a group of college students, I indulge in an idiosyncrasy of mine. I am making a kind of an unscholarly sociological survey. Let me ask you this. How many of you who are here, please raise your hands, have ever seen a real live rabbi before? How many of you have never seen a real live rabbi before? I tell you why I ask this question. About 3 years ago, I went to a convocation at St. Cloud College. It was an evening convocation, midwinter, and I don't like to drive in midwinter, so I came up by bus. And as we approached this little drugstore or variety store, which is was the bus depot there at that time, I noticed two young men, obviously from St. Cloud College, who were there to greet me and to take me up to the college. And I decided to experiment. In those days, I wore a shorty coat and a Rex Harrison hat. And I got off the bus. All the people were getting off the bus, and they all walked into this little store, and I got off the bus, and I walked into the little store, and they were waiting for the rabbi to get off that bus. And after everyone had departed and went to his respective home, I was the only one left. And these two fellows came up to me, and with some temerity, one of them asked, "Are you Rabbi Shapiro?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Gee, I thought you were going to have a long beard." And that's why I ask this question. As Dr. Skibby has indicated, there is a growing interest in ecumenicity, and because of the growing interest, there is a great interest in Jews and Judaism. At Temple Israel in Minneapolis, last year we had, by actual count, over 2,500 Christian visitors from the various churches who came to visit our service. And we have developed a program now, an orientation to the service. People come, we have an orientation to the service, and then they sit through the service, and then we have a period afterwards, a question period afterward. These groups are all from the various churches and some from the various seminaries in our area. And I can tell you very frankly that right now I could spend all my time lecturing to church groups, to sisterhood groups and youth groups and men's groups all over the city. The demand is unbelievable. We have letters written to us from all over the state as well, asking for a rabbi or some knowledgeable layperson to come to talk about Judaism. And the interesting thing is this, that whereas in the past Christianity or Christian students were interested in the Judaism of the past, the Judaism of Old Testament times, or perhaps the Judaism of the first century times. Today, the interest is in the living Jew today. Judaism as it appears upon the scene of history today, as it influenced American thinking, as a sociological phenomenon and a historical phenomenon, and as a religious phenomenon and a spiritual phenomenon in our times. And so my talk to you today is not going to be anything that is scholarly. What I'm going to attempt to do today is to give you information about the Jews, information that I have developed because of the variety of questions that Christians ask me as I make talks, and we have an opportunity for discussion afterwards. And so all that I'm going to say to you, because I'm only going to speak, I'm looking for the clock over there, I'm only going to speak for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. I'm going to try to give you a broad survey. What I'm going to say to you is an oversimplification, but nevertheless will hit some of the high spots. The first I must define three terms. And the first term is the term Jew. You've all used the term Jew, you all know the term. I wonder whether you know where it comes from. In the Bible, and when a Jew talks about the Bible, he talks about the Hebrew scriptures, the so-called Old Testament. In the Bible, in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis, there's a story of Abraham. And as you know, Abraham travels from his hometown in Ur in Chaldea, and he's going to Canaan. He's traveling from east to west. In order to get into Canaan, he has to cross the River Jordan. As you also know, in those days there was no such thing as last names. People were referred to by their fathers. Abraham was Avraham in the Hebrew, Avraham ben Terach, which meant Abraham the son of Terach, or by some characteristic, their occupation, a physical frailty or something of that nature. When Abraham crossed the river, there were very likely lots of people in Canaan named Abraham. And the people who saw him cross the river and who became his neighbors referred to Abraham as Abraham, the one who crossed the river. In the language of the Hebrew Bible, it becomes Avraham ho-Ivri, Abraham, the one who crossed over, or Abraham the Hebrew, because that's what the word Hebrew means, the one who crossed over. And that becomes his name and is referred to in this fashion all through the book of Genesis. Then, as you know, Abraham has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has a son named Jacob. And one day in the same book, Jacob is out in the field. It's a nice, balmy day. He's listening to a Twins game on his transistor, and he's grabbed from behind by an unknown adversary. And they wrestle all through the night. And when this wrestling match is over, this unknown adversary says to him, "No longer shall you be called Jacob. From now on, your name is Israel." And in Hebrew, this means someone who wrestled with God. The word Elohim means God. And he is known as Israel, and his children are referred to as the sons of Israel or the Israelites. And the word Hebrew drops out of scriptures. And these people are referred to as Israelites in that whole period they spend in Egypt for some 420 years, most of it as slaves. They are called the Israelites. And then you know the story, how Moses, the Redeemer, comes, leads them out back to Canaan. There they develop two countries, a country on the north called Israel, a country on the south called Judah. In 722 BC, Israel is destroyed by the Assyrians and vanishes from the face of history. And the people who were there are referred to in history as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They're gone. But two tribes remain. 2.5 tribes remain in Judah. Judah is the country where Saul and David and Solomon are the kings. This is the country where Jerusalem is the headquarters. The people of Judah are referred to as Judeans or Jews, Judes. And a corruption of the word Jude is Jew. If I were to say to you the Jew dived off the diving board, you wouldn't know whether I said the Jude dived off the diving board or the Jew. This is where the word Jew comes from. And so here are three terms, Hebrew, Israelite, and Jew, used to designate the same group of people at different times in their history, used interchangeably, actually, over the last century and even used today. I went to a seminary called the Hebrew Union College. There is a newspaper put out by Harry Golden called the Carolina Israelite. And the word Jew, of course, you know, is the word that's most prevalently used. And this is the word that is most common. And so this is the term. This is where the word Jew comes from. Secondly, the word synagogue. Now, I am at Temple Israel, and some people are confused about the word synagogue and temple. Every Jewish house of worship is called a synagogue. Now, in ancient Jewish history, in the year 586 BC, when Judah, the country of Judah, was standing, the Babylonians came down from the north and destroyed this country and destroyed their temple. There was a temple in Jerusalem. This temple was ministered over by a priestly class, the sons of Aaron, the brother of Moses. And this was the class that was an inherited group of people, a herited class. And they ministered to the people. They were the priests. They conducted the sacrificial cult and all the rest. In 586, when this temple was destroyed, the Jews were exiled to Babylonia. And there is a group, they lived for approximately 50 years. Babylonia was defeated by the Persians, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, allowed the Jews to come back. They came back and they built what was called a second temple. But during that 50 years while they were in Babylonia in exile, they had no place to worship, no temple. And so they used to gather together. So we see in the book of Ezekiel, they used to gather together in small groups and talk about their ancient cult. And from these little groups developed little prayer circles, little study circles. And they used the word synagogue, which is a Greek word meaning the house of meeting, to designate these small groups. When they came back, they built a temple, and the priests assumed their role again. But so enamored were they of these small groups that these small groups, the synagogues, continued, remained. And the leader of the synagogue became the teacher of the group. The word rabbi means my teacher. A man who presumably knew more than all the others was designated as the teacher of the group, as the rabbi of the group. Well, in the year 70 of the present era, the Romans destroyed this second temple. And this was gone for all times, and there was no place for the priests to exist. And so the synagogue took over the function. Synagogue took over the function, the religious function, and the rabbi became the religious functionary and the spiritual leader. And so every house of worship now is called a synagogue. But specific houses of worship may be called temples. This is the name. This is the specific name given to a synagogue. So my synagogue is called Temple Israel, and synagogue and temple are synonymous. And there is no longer a priestly class, and there are no longer any sacrifices in Jewish life. The spiritual leader of the congregation is the rabbi. Each congregation is autonomous. Every congregation is really administered by a board of trustees, lay people who are elected by the congregation and the rabbi. In order to become a rabbi, a liberal rabbi such as I am, requires, of course, a bachelor's degree. The seminary is a graduate school, 5 years of study, and 2 years in the service as a chaplain, if one is physically fit, and they need chaplains at the time. Then one is at liberty to be at a congregation. No one can tell any rabbi which congregation he should serve, and no one can tell any congregation which rabbi it can have. This is a call and a mutual relationship between congregation and rabbi. And if a rabbi does not serve the needs of his congregation, then the congregation may, without recourse to anyone else, ask him to leave. The rabbi is responsible to his congregation and to his congregation alone, and to no other hierarchy whatsoever. Well, then, these are the three terms, then. Synagogue, Jew, and rabbi. Now let me tell you something about Judaism. It seems to me that all religions have four rubrics. There are four things that make up a religion. One is a community, a group of people who are part of that religion. There are many religions of ancient days that are only words in history books today because there is no group of people that adheres to that religion. And so there's a community. Then there is a creed, what that community believes spiritually. And then there is a cult, the tradition and the holiday cycle and the like. And finally, there is a code and approach to morality. And let me characterize the Jewish community, the Judaism for you under these four headings. And the community I'm going to talk to you about will be the American Jewish community. As you know, there are Jews all over the world. There are communities, of course, the three great communities today are in the United States, where there are some 5.5 million Jews. We're not sure of the exact number. Russia, where there is an indication that there are some 3 million Jews, and no one is really sure of the exact number. The state of Israel, where there are some 2 million Jews, 2.25 million Jews, and then there are relatively large communities in England, in France, in Argentina, and in Canada. Now, the American Jewish community, as I said, is made up of some 5.5 million individuals. The first Jews to come to this country came in the year 1654. 23 of them came from out of Brazil and landed in the nearest Dutch colony, which was then New Amsterdam, and this colony, as you know, in 1664 became New York. The bulk of the Jews came to this country during the period, well, there was a second period, there was a period of Jews coming to this country between 1654 and about 1840, when this country was founded. When it became a nation of its own, there were about 2.5 million people at that time in the so-called, in the United States of that period. There were, as an estimate, about 2,500 Jews. A great many Jews came during the revolutionary period in Europe in the 1840s. But the bulk of the Jewish community came to this country in the 1880s and came with the great migrations from Eastern Europe, when Poles, Russians, Slovaks, Greeks, Armenians, that whole group came in vast numbers because this country was looking for people to help open up the West, as it would be, and the great business empires were growing at the time, and there was an escape, of course, from the tyranny of that part of Europe to this country. The Jews in this country are divided up, and we hate to say it, but there are three different sects. We don't like to call them sects, we call them groups. These are the Orthodox, the Conservative, and the Reform. And again, I must say that what my characterization of each one of these is an oversimplification. If you were to go, well, let me put it this way. Our Orthodox group is our fundamentalist group. This is a group which says that every word of the Bible, like remember when I talk Bible, I talk Old Testament, every word of the Bible is the Word of God, and certain commentaries upon this Bible, called the Talmud, 66 little tracts of commentary, all these are sacred and must be adhered to. The ritual, the moral mandate, all must be adhered to religiously. Now, and so if you were to go into an Orthodox congregation, you would find a number of things. First, you would find, for example, that prayer is in Hebrew, and primarily in Hebrew. I would say 95%. Very good reason for this. According to Jewish tradition, God dictated the first 5 books of the Bible to Moses while he was on Sinai for those 40 days and 40 nights. The first 5 books of the Bible, the so-called Torah or the Pentateuch, was written in Hebrew. Consequently, God dictated it in Hebrew. Hebrew became the holy language. And so prayer was in the language that God had used at that time. And so consequently, the prayer service is in Hebrew. You would find, for example, that the men keep their heads covered when they pray. In the Middle East, from which Judaism came, in the Middle East, when a Muslim goes to pray, he doesn't remove his hat when he walks into a mosque. He removes his shoes. One wears his hat at all times. I spent 2 years in Egypt during the war, and whenever I say this, I have to identify the wars these days. This was World War II. I spent 2 years in Egypt during the war, and in Egypt, all the men look like Shriners. They're all wearing fezzes. Wherever you go, they wear a fez. If we were to have a convocation such as this in Egypt, I and Dr. Skippy would be wearing fezzes, and all you fellas would be wearing fezzes out there. You wouldn't take off your hat. You go to a movie, the men keep their fezzes on. You go to a bank, the teller is wearing a fez. It is a sign of respect, strange it may seem in that area, to keep your head covered. Now, there are reasons, I'm sure, why this became the custom, but nevertheless, it was the custom in Jewish life as well. And so when Jews moved into the Western world, they said, we will cover our heads as a sign of respect in prayer. The traditional Jews said this. If you were to walk into an Orthodox congregation, you would also find that the men and the women are separate. Men sit in one part of the congregation, women sit in another part. And again, this comes out of the East. In those days, it wasn't incumbent upon women to go to pray. They could come when their household chores were over. And so they might come late. In order for them not to disturb the service, they were given a place in the rear, because the men might be distracted as they came in. I must tell you a wonderful story about this. I have a friend by the name of Edgar Magnin, Rabbi Magnin, out in Los Angeles. How many of you have ever heard the name Norma Shearer? Ah, golly, what you missed. How nice it is to be older. Norma Shearer was the great movie queen of, 35 years ago, I guess, or so. Well, Miss Shearer married a gentleman who was Jewish by the name of Irving Thalberg, who was with the movie studios, and Dr. Magnin was instrumental in converting her. And he tells this story that during the high holy days, when the synagogue, the temple was crowded, and when Norma Shearer would come into the temple, he would stop the service. He said she was a regal person, and he wanted to treat her in that manner. And anyway, he said none of the men would pray. They'd all watch Norma Shearer come down the aisle. So you can see that women can distract the men, and this is what was the idea. All right. Now, among the Orthodox Jews also, because I say they follow the biblical law religiously, there is in the book of Leviticus, chapter 11, a whole series of ritual foods. These are the things which ye may eat. Now, there's no reason given why you may eat them or why you may not eat them, because there are things there that you may not eat. But this is the statement. And this is the basis of what is known as kosher food. The word kosher means pure. And there are basically 4 kinds of foods which one may eat or may not eat. The only kinds of meat you may eat is meat that comes from animals that chew the cud and have a cloven hoof. So you can't eat the rock badger, and you can't eat the swine, and no rhinoceros steaks or things of that nature. You can, for example, you cannot eat birds of prey. No, the eagle and the owl cannot be eaten at all. You cannot eat any fish that does not have fins or scales. You cannot eat anything that swarms on the ground, snakes or eels. You cannot eat any insects that fly, no chocolate-covered bumblebees or any of that stuff, which is so delicious, they tell me. Well, these are the things these are certain things that you cannot, and these are given. Now, and you also may not mix meat and milk, and I must tell you about this. 2 places in the Pentateuch, there is a statement, thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. S-E-E-T-H-E, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. The rabbis of old looked at this statement and they said, well, what in the world does it mean? Nobody goes around boiling a kid in its mother's milk. And there it is. There it is right there in Scripture, dictated by God to Moses. It must mean something. What could it possibly mean? And they came to the conclusion that it meant you must not mix meat products and milk products. You must not mix dairy products and meat products. And so in the kosher process, one does not mix meat and milk. It means that if I were to have a steak dinner, I couldn't have ice cream for dessert. This kind of thing. You don't eat them at the same meal. Now we have discovered, archaeologists have discovered, that the reason why this crept into the Pentateuch was because the pagan of the time used to do that. Used to boil a kid in its mother's milk. And this was a means of avoiding the practices of the pagan. Well, nonetheless, this is the kosher process. The Orthodox Jew follows this, or is supposed to follow this process. In my mother's house, my family was very traditional. In my mother's house, we followed this most religiously. We never had cream, for example, at the table when we had meat. And so they developed this process. In my mother's house and all traditional Jewish homes, we have 2 sets of dishes and 2 sets of silverware. 1 set of dishes only for meat products, 1 set of dishes only for dairy products. And you wouldn't put you wouldn't put cottage cheese on a plate which is reserved for the meat products. This is within the framework of Orthodox Judaism or traditional Judaism. On the other extreme are strange people like myself. We are the liberals. We are the reformers. We say something like this. We say that in the Bible there are 2 truths. One truth, a truth that never changes, the moral truths, and there's a truth dealing with customs, a truth dealing with certain kind of based on certain kind of historical events that have no validity today. And so, if you were to come into Temple Israel, you would find first that the men sit with their heads uncovered. We say that it is a sign of respect in this community to uncover one's head, and so we ask our people to uncover their heads when they pray at Temple Israel. You would find that men and women sit together at prayer, and families sit together. You would find that our service is primarily in English, in the vernacular. I would say about 85%, because we want our people to understand the service. And you will find that we say that, as I said, there are certain kinds of approaches that are outmoded. We say that progress comes about through change. There should be change in religion as well as in everything else. And because we want to progress in our thinking and in our approaches to religious life, we say if you want to keep these laws dealing with kosher products, you may, but you don't have to. This isn't binding upon you. And then there is the middle ground. There is the conservative group. The conservative group's theology is very much like the liberal group, but its practices are very much like the Orthodox group. For example, let me indicate, perhaps a little too facetiously, how they would approach this. Orthodox Jews, for example, will eat only in their homes, only in their homes, because the restaurants don't have 2 sets of dishes and kosher foods. The liberal Jew will eat in any restaurant and will eat meat and doesn't bother him. The conservative Jew will eat in any restaurant but will only eat fish, won't eat meat. This is his concession. Or, put it this way, according to Orthodox Judaism, no one can ride on the Sabbath. Sabbath, no work. In the ancient days, to ride meant work. So nobody rides on the Sabbath. The Reformed Jew says, well, to get into my Chevrolet and step on the starter is not work. I ride on the Sabbath. The conservative Jew says, well, you may ride, but only to religious services. And this is the kind of in-between it. So this is the Jewish community of this country. Now, what does this community believe? Jews don't have a creed, a written creed. For example, this may come as a surprise to you. I was never asked when I was ordained, what do you believe? No one asked me this. We have a framework in which we work. And when I teach my confirmation class, I give them a framework. And I tell their parents that we're not going to ask these kids to write down in confirmation what they believe. We ask them what their ideas are about certain things, but we don't make them adhere to a certain line. There is a framework. And the framework starts out with a statement out of the book of Deuteronomy, which says this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This statement makes 2 assumptions, really, that there is a God and God is one. And Jews in the ancient days never tried to prove the existence of God. It was always known. It was always assumed that there was a God. And this is where we work today, even though they're under the influence of Christian philosophy in the early ages. Jews began also to try to prove the existence of a God. But by and large, this is the statement. It's a statement made at every service. At every service that there is, the Jews say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And the characteristic is, I'm not going to try to characterize God for you according to Jewish tradition, but there are all kinds of the omnipotence, and all the rest, and I don't have to give them to you. But there is one thing that is central, the idea that God is a unity and is one. From this comes the whole concept in Jewish life of the brotherhood of man. The rabbis of old, as I told you, were very interesting people. They used to sit around and talk about old 2,100 years ago, 2,200 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,800 years ago. They used to sit around and discuss these things. They read that Pentateuch, that Torah, as it is called, so assiduously and so carefully. They weighed every word, somehow like you must read the sports page after an Augsburg football game, every word to know exactly what took place. Well, they asked themselves questions because a lot of questions were unanswered. Questions like this: why in the world did God create only one man at the beginning? There's a God that's omnipotent. He could create a whole caboodle of men, women, and children and fill up the world. Why only one? Was he tired? And they tossed this thing around, and they came to this conclusion. They said, God created only one man at the beginning. So no one would ever be able to say, my father is better than yours. Or, for example, they said, where in the world did God get the dust from to breathe into Adam? Not in heaven. No dust in heaven. So where did he get it from? They worried about this kind of thing. Can you imagine that? They worried about this kind of thing. They said finally in their answer, God went to the 4 corners of the earth, got dust from the 4 corners, mixed it all together, and breathed it into Adam to indicate that in every man is the essence of all men. Or, for example, they said, why is it Why is it that God waited until Sinai to give Moses the Ten Commandments, until that no man's land, that desert? And that's really what the Hebrew word is, arava, to indicating the desert. It's a no man's land, a desolate place. Why wait until this desolate place? Wouldn't it have been better if he gave Moses the Ten Commandments, as the children of Israel were leaving Egypt, he would have held them up. It would have been a great spectacle for Samuel Goldwyn to film. Why didn't he do that? And they said God gave Moses the Ten Commandments in a no man's land to indicate that it didn't belong to anybody, to any group of people. It belonged universally. Well, this is the whole approach. It's the approach to brotherhood, which became part of Jewish life. There is, for example, the concept of the Torah, these first 5 books. The Torah for a Jew is, for the Orthodox Jew, of course, is important because this is God's law and God's word. For the liberal Jew, the Torah is important because in it we find the essence of the way that a man should live. This is the moral approach to life. This book, the Torah, the first 5 books were the Constitution of the Jews. An amazing constitution. There are, by the way, the rabbis have all found 613 laws in it, 365 thou shalt nots, and 248 thou shalts. You can go research this yourself if you would like. But there are, they said, 613 laws. Interesting laws. The book of Leviticus, chapter 19, Here's a law, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Quite a law for a constitution. Most of the social legislation that we find today is embedded in this document. And the attitudes toward one's parents, one's neighbors, one's fellow human being, all these, the Jews say, the liberal Jews say, can be found in the Torah. And this becomes a guide for us. And this is the value of the Torah. In this way, it is God-inspired. There is, for example, there are other basic beliefs, and I can't go through them, but let me mention just 2 of them for you. The idea of the chosen people. As you know, developed in the Pentateuch, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, is the concept of the chosen people, the covenant relationship, as it is called, between the Jewish people and God. Jews say this. They have not, the idea of being chosen because they're better than anyone else is kind of a false thing. It's a matter of being a choosing people. They chose the Lord to be their God. And because they chose the Lord, they undertook what they looked upon themselves to have as a kind of a mission, to serve as an example for mankind, to live up to a high moral plane. And this became the idea of the chosen people, choosing to be the example to all mankind wherever possible. Then finally, there is the idea of the Messianic age. The Jews believe, the traditional Jew, the Orthodox Jew believes in a Messiah. The characteristics of the Messiah are these. A human being, somebody who would be descended from the great royal family, the household of David, someone who would appear upon the scene of history at some time, who would become the king of the Jews, give the Jews back their homeland and the land of Palestine, and in some miraculous way bring peace and brotherhood to all humankind. The Orthodox Jew still believes in this. The Jews do not look upon, as you must know, do not look upon Jesus as being their Messiah. Jews look upon Jesus in this fashion. Again, this is an oversimplification. They look upon him as a human being, someone in the line of the prophets, but not a prophet, someone who is a great and magnificent and perhaps the most pervasive teacher of the Western, of all humankind, certainly of the Western world, one who had a great spiritual and religious message to give to the world, but not as anyone divine in any way, a human being. And liberal Jews have even taken this concept, the concept of the Messiah, which is used by the Orthodox Jews, and changed that. Liberal Judaism came upon the scene of history in 1801. As you well know, this was an age of colonialism, this was an age of imperialism, and it seemed inconsonant with the age to think that a human being could come and do all the things that this human being was going to do. Remember that in those days, the country of Palestine belonged to the Turkish Empire. And so they developed the idea of a messianic age, a time when there would be brotherhood and peace on earth. But this would not be brought about not through any external intervention, and it would be something that was internal, that every human being everywhere, not only in the Western world, but in the Eastern world, Africa, every human being living up to the highest ethical tenets of his religion had to bring this about. This was something that God wanted man to do, not that God would impose upon mankind. Well, these are some of the beliefs. I must rush along. You see, I thought that I could tell you all that I learned in 5 years at the seminary in 40 minutes. I see that I can't, and my professors are going to be very proud of me. Let me tell you something about our cult. The Jewish holiday cycle is based on the Pentateuch as well. All the holidays, save one or two, are there, and this becomes the source for them. Our holidays and our festivals go from nightfall to nightfall. The Jewish day, according to the ancient tradition, stems from nightfall to nightfall. A reason for everything is a reason for this. If you were to read the first paragraph of the book of Genesis, you would see that it ends in this way. And there was evening and there was morning on the first day. And the rabbis of old said, well, that's the way that first day was created. Evening first, and then morning. So, that if we were going to have a festival tomorrow, we would start tonight, go from tonight to tomorrow night. What that means is, it's a hardship on rabbis, ladies and gentlemen. What that means is we have two sets of services. We have a service tonight, and we have a service tomorrow morning. And instead of preaching once on a festival, I have to preach twice. Well, be that as it may. Now, there are 4 categories of festivals. There is the Sabbath, which is a festival. The Sabbath, the Jews say, is a day given for joy, for worship, and for rest. In the ancient tradition, this was handled in this fashion. I'll tell you what went on in my father's home. My father would come home from work. He would go to services on Friday evening with his children. He would come home from services on Friday evening. He would have dinner at home, and then one would sit around the house. The next day, services in the morning. The afternoon spent with family, visiting family or reading. That was all. And the evening, whatever one wanted to do. It was a day of rest and a day of relaxation, primarily. No riding at all. You stayed in the house, you walked distances, but that was it. Your enjoyment was from your home and from your family. Today this has changed somewhat. We look upon the day, of course, still as a day of joy, of worship, and of rest. But my professor of theology had an approach to rest, which, of course, is in consonant with our thinking, and a very good one. You know, on Saturday afternoons, for example, in the winter time, I go to the, you'll forgive me, I go to the Gopher football games, not to the Augsburg games. In the summer, I used to take my son swimming. He's outgrown me now. But we would do something. My professor of theology used to say, on the Sabbath, his rest consisted of not studying. He studied all through the week. On the Sabbath, he did everything but study. He rested from his workaday labors. And then we try to maintain this as best as possible. Then there are the holy days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the New Year and the Day of Atonement. And I'm going to hurry along with this. These are magnificent days, it seems to me. The day of the Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, is a day in which Jews come to the synagogue, and they're under the aegis of this religious atmosphere. They take inventory of themselves. They say to themselves, what kind of a person were you during the past year? What kind of a husband or a wife or a son, daughter? What kind of an employer, employee? Where did you fall down here in this religious atmosphere? And then 10 days later, they come at the Day of Atonement, which is a day of fasting, and we're in the synagogue virtually all day long. We say again, under the aegis of religion, forgive us, God, for not having fulfilled our potential, and we pray that we may be able to in the year to come. This is the Day of Atonement. Now, the rabbis of old, I say, were very bright, and they said, this is kid stuff, coming to the synagogue and asking God for forgiveness. God forgives, So what's so magnificent about this, even though you fast? They said, you know what you must also do in order to really attain forgiveness? You must search out those people whom you have offended during the year that has passed and ask them for forgiveness as well. And if you can do both of these, then you will be truly forgiven. And this, let me tell you, is the most salutary thing that anyone can do. I don't know about how many people in the congregation do this, or if anyone. I try from time to time. And it really the greatest kind of cleansing experience that any human being can have. Then there are 3 festivals: Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuos. Passover is our festival of freedom. It commemorates the freeing of the Jews from slavery in Egypt. Sukkot is the festival of Thanksgiving and a harvest festival. This is by the way, our American holiday of Thanksgiving is based on this biblical concept of Sukkot Thanksgiving. This is a time when deals with the 40 years of wandering and with the bringing of the first fruits to the temple, thanking God for the harvest. And finally, there's a festival of Shavuos, the Feast of Weeks, which is the holiday commemorating the giving of the 10 Commandments. And it is on this day that we have our confirmation exercises. And our kids are confirmed when they are at the end of their sophomore year in high school, when they are around 16 years of age. And lastly, there are 2 minor festivals. One festival that's it's a very minor festival, and yet it's become popular and become major in this country only. This is the festival of Hanukkah, and it's become major in this country because of its juxtaposition to Christmas. It falls around the winter solstice. It falls around anywhere between the 5th and the 28th of December. This is a minor festival. It deals with a revolution by the people of Palestine against the Greeks, who were then in control of the country around the year 165 BC, and its basis is freedom of religion. The Jews who revolted at that time revolted because they didn't want to worship Zeus. And this was the underlying theme of this revolt, and the concept is freedom of religion. And finally, there's a festival based on the biblical book of Esther called Purim, which is a kind of a Mardi Gras time. It's a carnival time, which will be coming around perhaps to fall on Easter Sunday this year, on March 26th, if any of you don't know when Easter Sunday comes this year. So these are the holiday. These are the holiday cycles. Finally, there is the code. The code of Jewish practice is the code that is endemic to American society. I mean, we all know this, dignity of man and the like, but let me just tell you how the rabbis handle this in the Talmud. The rabbis in the Talmud, as I indicated to you, said there were 613 laws in this Torah. And they said anyone who would follow these laws would certainly be an exemplary character and would go to heaven. And then they worried. They said, who in the world is going to research these 613 laws? And there must have been an advertising man in the group, because he said, let's get a slogan like LSMFT, something as soon as you hear it, you'll know all the 613 laws, you know exactly what they stand for. And so they searched the Old Testament, and they came up with all kinds of slogans, until finally one man came up with a statement. The book one out of Micah, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee? Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. And he said, anyone who does these 3 things will have fulfilled the 613 commandments. And you don't have to be Jewish to go to heaven, to fulfill the 613 commandments. All you have to do is do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. This is the basis of the whole approach to Jewish moral life. Well, I think that I am just at the end of my talk. Let me just say one more thing. In the ancient days, in order to to be ordained. A man would come and study with a rabbi, and then after that rabbi thought he knew enough, he would call in two other rabbis to examine the man. And then the three rabbis felt that he could pass all the requirements that they had in their mind. Then the three of them as a group could ordain that man the fourth man as a rabbi. Three rabbis could ordain a fourth. Well, there are two other rabbis at Temple Israel. I have told you all I really know about Judaism. If any of you people want to become rabbis, come and see me and we'll get you ordained. Thank you very much.